You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So today's trial date is wrapped. We've got some especially incriminating testimony against Donald Trump. But first, for those watching, Glenn and I will be doing daily comprehensive coverage of Donald Trump's criminal trial. So if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. Okay, Glenn, as for the testimony against Trump, there was one thing that David Pecker said that was especially incriminating against Trump. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, David Pecker, remarkably, but perhaps not surprisingly, admitted that this stuff that he was doing, these catch and kill schemes where he was paying people to bury deeply damaging information about Donald Trump that clearly would have hurt him in his candidacy. David Pecker said, you know what? These things were not even in the business interest of AMI, his company, or the National Enquirer. They were to help Donald Trump not be damaged in his run for the presidency. Boy, that is some powerfully incriminating evidence for, let me call David Pecker what he is, one of Donald Trump's co-conspirators. So it was David Pecker, Michael Cohen, and Donald Trump in this conspiracy to try to hide this information from the American voters and, in a very real sense, rob us all of the full value of our vote. So, you know what, it's interesting, Brian, that Donald Trump has not seen fit to criticize David Pecker openly, either in the run-up to the trial or during the course of the trial. I have an idea of why that is. But nevertheless, Pecker's testimony was pretty devastating to Donald Trump.
And so can you speak about how that lends itself to the charges that Trump is contending with?
Yeah, so what people need to keep in mind is all of this testimony from David Pecker is what we call uncharged misconduct, because David Pecker was not involved in the Stormy Daniels payoff or the cover-up of the Stormy Daniels payoff, which involved falsifying business records, which is a crime under the laws of the state of New York. And ultimately, the entire thing was done to gain unfair advantage in the election, violating election campaign laws, which is what bumps these crimes up to felony charges. Now, David Pecker was involved in the doorman payoff. I'm not going to go through the backstory of that. There was some information from a New York doorman that Donald Trump may have had an out-of-wedlock child. The reporting is that ultimately proved not to be true, but nevertheless, David Pecker paid to kill that story so it didn't hurt Donald Trump. He was then intimately involved and in many ways took the lead on the catch and kill Karen McDougal piece of this. But all of that is just kind of setting the table in the Trump trial. These are like the appetizers. And what the prosecution is proving to the jury is that Donald Trump was in this conspiracy with David Pecker, with Michael Cohen, to engage in this criminal scheme for political advantage. And then they're going to get into the meat of it, which is the Stormy Daniels payoff, the falsifying business records, all done for political advantage, not for personal advantage. He wasn't trying to hide this information from his family. That has already been proved a couple of times over. This was about politics. So right now, the David Pecker testimony was to give the jury an idea of how Donald Trump went about this corrupt scheme, and then the prosecutors will shift into the charged offenses, which directly involve Stormy Daniels.
And further proving this is the fact that it would actually have been better for David Pecker and the National Enquirer to report on these salacious stories. So the fact that he not only didn't report on them, but killed them is just a testament to the fact that this really was simply, only, exclusively to help Donald Trump in his campaign.
And that is really where David Pecker kind of drives another nail into Donald Trump's legal coffin, because it takes away the argument that, well, all of this was really just the National Enquirer doing business the way it ordinarily does business. But you know what? It ordinarily does business for profit. And
right.
This was not working to the financial advantage of AMI or the National Enquirer. Now, David Pecker wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his own heart. You can bet, after he was done sort of corruptly, indeed criminally, getting Donald Trump elected, once Donald Trump was in the Oval Office, David Pecker was going to expect a little bit of advantageous treatment coming out of the Oval Office, indeed coming out of the federal government writ large. So, let's not mistakenly believe that David Pecker was in this for altruism or just because Donald Trump was his very good friend.
Right. Glenn, there was a moment yesterday that I want to discuss with you. There was this moment where it became clear through testimony that Hope Hicks and Sarah Huckabee Sanders were coordinating strategy on whether to extend Karen McDougal's contract, this is the hush money contract, while they were working in the White House, meaning while they were taxpayer-funded government officials. What are the implications of that revelation?
Well, first of all, you have to wonder if Hope Hicks and Sarah Huckabee Sanders might have a little bit of liability or exposure, but we don't know yet because Hope Hicks hasn't yet testified. But at a minimum, it is deeply disturbing and unseemly and just generally abusive of what government officials and employees are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be working on behalf of the American people for our benefit, and instead what they're doing is scheming and conniving, perhaps even conspiring, though whether criminally or otherwise, to try to continue to hide damaging information from the American people about Donald Trump. And, if that is not an absolute perversion of what government employees are supposed to be doing, I don't know what is. And here's the thing, Brian. Yes, we heard from David Pecker, who is a friend of Donald Trump, but really more of a business associate. But we are about to hear from Hope Hicks, who, was very much a confidant of Donald Trump's. She was in the room often, certainly on many, many, many occasions that David Pecker was not in the room. And she is likely to have some direct statements from Donald Trump about this whole, sad episode. And those statements might be sharply incriminating. We don't know yet because, we haven't really had much of a preview of Hope Hicks' testimony. It seems like the prosecution, by and large, has kept that under wraps in a way they weren't able to keep under wraps the David Peckers of the world and certainly the Michael Cohens of the world, who, talks all day, early and often about how he is aggrieved by Donald Trump. And I don't blame him. He was a co-conspirator of Donald Trump. He was complicit in these very crimes that are being charged now. And he, Michael Cohen, was prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned for, among other things, these campaign finance violations. Donald Trump, all the while, is out playing golf and going to fundraisers. I would be pretty damn aggrieved, too, if I were Michael Cohen. But again, we know a lot about what Michael Cohen is going to say when he hits the witness stand, but we know very little about what Hope Hicks is going to say, and that's coming up probably as early as next week.
And by the way, just a quick note on Michael Cohen. Is it true that it can lend itself further to Donald Trump's prosecution, the fact that Cohen was convicted and sentenced to prison for the same crime that Donald Trump himself facilitated? Is that going to be taken into account by the jury in this case? The
answer is yes and no, and we're going to have to do just a very short legal breakdown law school class here on this, and I won't go too deep down into the legal weeds. So remember, Michael Cohen pleaded guilty and was imprisoned in part for being part and parcel of these crimes that Donald Trump is now being tried for. David Pecker was also criminally liable for these same crimes, being part of this same conspiracy. How do we know that? Well, before the prosecutors ever got to sit down with David Pecker and get all of the incriminating information that he had, they had to give him what's called a non-prosecution agreement. What does that mean? It means that he very likely committed crimes, but rather than charge him with those crimes, get him to plead guilty to those crimes and become a formal cooperating witness, for whatever reason, prosecutors a few years ago decided, we're going to promise not to prosecute him, give him a non-prosecution agreement, which extinguishes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So he has to tell the prosecutors what he knows about his own crimes and the crimes of Michael Cohen, Donald Trump, and anybody else involved in this corrupt scheme. So think about it. 2 of the 3 conspirators are sort of known to have criminal responsibility for the very conspiracy and the very crimes that Donald Trump is on trial for. Here's the caveat that people need to keep in mind. Prosecutors can't walk into court and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Michael Cohen was convicted of these crimes. David Pecker, who was part and parcel of these crimes, got a non-prosecution agreement, which means he also committed these crimes. We want you to use the fact that those two people committed crimes and got a non-prosecution agreement or were prosecuted for it as evidence of Donald Trump's guilt. You can't, there is not a one-to-one application like that. Instead, the jury gets to hear all about these things, the non-pros agreement and Michael Cohen's guilty plea and imprisonment, to sort of assess the facts underlying everything that went on here and underlying what they're trying to prove about Donald Trump. But I hope I explained that sufficiently. You don't use, for instance, the guilty plea of Michael Cohen as evidence that Donald Trump committed the same crimes. You can introduce that evidence, but for other reasons, and the judge will give the jury what's called a limiting instruction. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard about Michael Cohen and what he did, David Pecker and what he did. You can consider the underlying facts, but you can't conclude Donald Trump is guilty just because they're guilty.
Got it. Okay. Well, there's going to obviously be plenty of other pieces of evidence for the jury to be able to conclude that Donald Trump is guilty regardless. Of course, we have plenty more to come in this trial. So again, for those watching right now, if you want to follow along with our daily comprehensive coverage, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.